Hello, Trisha.
Hello, Sophie.
Hello. So we have decided today to think together about the component of difference.
Mhm.
And I thought, or we agreed that what might be a nice way to start this is to share the latest update from Nancy on this component. Because I think of all of the components in the time I've been doing this work, this one's probably had the most evolutions and the most change. And so it'd be really nice just to make sure we're on kind of the ground that we're on. So I'll share this. So this was dated February this year. So this is the kind of the latest update. And what I'm reading from is Nancy's, one of her fine points. So what is this component anyway? And that's a good question, isn't it? What is this component? For 30 years, we have been trying to define the component of difference, or diversity, as we called it while that term remained fresh. There have been 5 definitions so far, and I've been involved for 4 of these. I wonder if you've been involved for all 5. So the first was adding quality because of the differences between us. The second, encouraging divergent thinking, ensuring diverse group identities. The third, championing our inherent diversity of identity and thought. 4, prioritizing group identities and understanding their lived experience. And the 5th, and this is the most current evolution, is committing to freedom from untrue assumptions driving prejudice. So the first 4 were nuanced versions of each other. They helped, but they described rather than defined. The 5th and current version finally, hooray, defines, as any good definition should. So I propose we now try that definition, committing to freedom from untrue assumptions driving prejudice. I've talked with various collegiate colleagues about this definition, and we agree wonderfully that it does the job, but its own difference can at first be startling because it can seem not related to any of the others. So I offer this thought pathway to show the logic behind the definition. The observation. Untrue assumptions lived as true inhibit independent thinking. Prejudice is a body of untrue assumptions about group identities. The implication, prejudice is therefore a thinking inhibitor. The consequence of that is to think for ourselves well, we need to be immersed in a commitment to freedom from prejudice. The action. To manifest this commitment to freedom from prejudice, we can establish the practice of, number 1, equal turns to think and speak. Number 2, uninterrupted attention fueled by interest in where the thinker will go next. We can express this commitment and achieve this freedom also by populating thinking times with as many different group identities as possible. We can then strengthen this commitment through the time to think diversity process. Here, we increase our knowledge of the assumptions that drive identity prejudice, deepen our understanding of the lived experience of those identities, and free ourselves of our own internalized versions of that prejudice. There's a lot in here, isn't there? That's why. Diversity of thought. But what about diversity of thought? That dimension of difference is still missing. And I understand if some of you feel strongly that diversity of thought belongs in this new definition. But diversity of thought should not have appeared in the second and third definitions in the first place. Diversity of thought is not a dimension of any of the components, it's a product of all. In order to produce diversity of thought, we need to experience all of the components, including, of course, difference, our commitment to freedom from prejudice. And then it just says the difference history. Freeing ourselves from untrue assumptions about group identity, that monster thinking inhibitor called prejudice, was the reason we included this component in the original list. From the beginning, it was clear that prejudice is a thinking inhibitor, and later we understood that prejudice itself is driven by untrue assumptions about identity. So eventually we concluded that in order to think well for ourselves, we would need to free ourselves and each other from those particular identity assumptions. But we did not until now know quite how to turn all of that into a succinct definition of difference. It can take longer than might seem necessary to see the obvious. But the thinking environment is full of exactly those revelatory moments when what was there all along suddenly becomes visible. So maybe difference is not so different after all. And it's interesting. I was thinking about what would be our question, what would be our question that we wanted to think about. And mine is almost framing that as is different? Is the component of difference different? Is there something about this particular component that makes it more challenging, more tricky? Yeah, so I mean, having just heard all of that, Trish, where's your starting point for our think this morning?
Well, I think that was an incredibly useful way to start, and thank you for reading that afresh. I mean, for me, and I don't know whether I'm right about this, because I think I do sometimes get into tricky territory by thinking about the components in this way. But on the other hand, it is what we say in the body of work and philosophy and theory and practice, which is the thinking environment, that the thinking environment is a way of being in the world, and that the way of being is encompassed in the 10 components of a thinking environment. So where I always go with any of these definitions of the components is, what's the way of being that does that definition does that definition draw forth a particular way of being that I can embody and know what the experience of embodying it is like. And I think this is one of the things that's always fascinating as teachers of the thinking environment, is that because we can never fully know what it's like to be each other, I don't know what your embodying of the components feels like for you, but I trust that you will know what that feels like in your practice of embodying it, and I work on knowing what it is for me. So if I think about, so in that way, I don't think the component of difference is different to any of the others. I think that it is inviting a way of being from me. And if I look at the current definition, then what way of being is it inviting from me? And I think the way of being that it's inviting from me is to be awake to the untrue limiting assumptions that I have taken on over the course of my lifetime, which in my case, I mean, this component is a very, very, very personal journey for me, being born white in Africa. But what are the untrue limiting assumptions that I've taken on over the course of my lifetime? And am I, as a way of being in my life, committing to freeing myself from those? And am I committing in every single interaction that I have with other human beings to spot the presence of them in the event that they're lurking, which, let's face it, they probably are, and continually liberate myself and assist other people to do the same where appropriate. And that's a big question, how do you help someone to liberate themselves from untrue limiting assumptions that might be driving prejudice in their way of being in the world if they're not thinking about that for themselves? And I think that's a big question that I sit with, in terms of, if this is an invitation to commit to creating environments that are free from those assumptions that drive prejudice, then how do I help other people to do that if they're not focused on that for themselves? But those are my freshest thoughts right off the bat. What do you think?
God, even as we're just starting to explore this, Trish, I think what it makes me really appreciate is like how big the components are. So in some ways they're so simple, aren't they? We talk about these components and they're so, and yet actually you take any one of them, like especially like this particular component, and there's like a lifetime's work involved in being this component. And I think maybe that's why it can sometimes feel quite big for people. It can sometimes feel quite challenging. And what I always go back to, so when you were saying, like, when you explore the components, like, I love that when like when we talk about the components and we say it's like it's something that people need in order to think well, and it's something that can be missing, but it's also something that can be presenced. And I love that kind of that little structure. Me, I like a bit of structure. Because when I think about all of those, it's like, well, of course, you know, for me to be able to think as myself, of course I need what makes me who I am, you know, all of that experience I've had to make me who I am now. I need that to be not a thinking inhibitor.
Mm.
And I think this component really challenges me to really think about, so like I've got to challenge my own assumptions, and I've got to challenge my own prejudice about my own group identities that might limit my own thinking, which is like a lifetime's work. And so there's that piece, but then I've also got to be aware that I'm also judging and prejudiced against other people. And so there's this dual work that needs to happen in order for us to sit with other people. So we've done our own work, but we've also then, that would then enables us to have less. And when I think about this, I think there's so much in this, because as soon as I've got judgments or assumptions about who I am, my group identities, my lived experience, I think it doesn't take me long to jump from that to actually feelings of shame or feelings of fear or feelings of embarrassment. Because sometimes these are the very things that I don't want to admit to myself. You know, and so, and then we've got that interplay of like denial. So it's like, oh, it just feels really uncomfortable to think I might be as judgmental as I am or as prejudiced as I am. And therefore, I don't like that feeling because it makes me feel like I'm not a very nice person. And so I'm just going to pretend it's not there. But if I do that, not only am I inhibiting my own ability to think, but I'll also be inhibiting other people's ability.
Mm.
You know, and that's where I think this work is so deeply rich, but also incredibly challenging. What do you think?
I just what you just said there just took me off into a little I had a moment of response stream, kind of like, quick, manage it, manage it, manage it. Because which is always the thing with dialogue, isn't it? We were talking about this in our dialogue on dialogue. Yeah, it's such an incredible level of skill to stay interested in where you'll go next in your thinking when something that you've just said sparks a thought for me. But it was the thing that you said about getting into denial about our own prejudice and the judgments that we have. And so I immediately saw that dance between difference in this case, because that's what we're talking about, and information. You know, one of the older definitions of information, which was dismantling denial, which I still absolutely love and teach when I'm teaching it, even though the definition has moved on from there. I don't think the lived practice of information has moved on from there. I think dismantling denial is still very much part of what we practice in order to absorb facts. And that's interesting, actually, isn't it, Sophie? Because the fundamental, one of the key fundamental assumptions that has driven prejudice over the years is the assumption that one group of people are unable to think as well for themselves as another group is, and therefore the group that's better able to think will think for the group that it's not as well able to think. And that's one of the fundamental untrue limiting assumptions that has driven sexism and racism and classism and ableism and ageism. You know, so all the isms, which is what happens to prejudice when it becomes structural and goes into the water we swim in. But yeah, so just got really kind of, I mean, I'm always just so, I get very geeky, like very, very geeky when I can see the relationship between assumptions, because I think that that's, you know, they are like, have you ever seen a geodesic dome? Do you know what a geodesic
No,
dome is?
I'm sure maybe describe it and I'll.
Yeah. Actually, there's a kid's toy that looks a little bit like a geodesic dome, which is like they come in plastic now, but you open it out and suddenly it's a ball and it's got all these lines that are joined up together. Anyway, it's a structure that got invented by a guy who was an absolutely incredible human being, brain on legs. Buckminster Fuller was his name, and he invented this structure which has got something called tensile integrity, which is that it looks literally like a dome which is made of kind of like lines, that so it's got no walls, but it holds itself up through the incredible. Anyway, I always think of the components like that, like they hold each other up, and the minute one of them wobbles, the others will fall apart at the seams if you don't get it back together again. So yeah, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but there is, but no, I haven't actually. I'm getting myself back to it, which is that what drives prejudice, the untrue limiting assumptions that drive prejudice, I mean, they're not facts. That's the thing about them. They're assumptions. They're not facts. Like the idea that men are better capable, more clever, more intelligent, more able to rule the world than women, it's not a fact. It's a lie. It's not true. That white people are better able to think than black people, are more civilized than black people. It's not true. It's a lie. And so it's lies that we've internalized. And the same as you were saying about the untrue limiting assumptions that you've internalized about your own group identities, which will probably have been, if you spawned by these more universal lies that the whole human race have internalized around, depending on which class you were born into. I mean, Britain is riddled with classism. I mean, it's like I don't know if it's the birthplace of classism. Maybe India was, I don't know. But, just those massive structures of untrue limiting assumptions that have just gone into the water that people have drunk over the years. And then what you were saying about the work that we have to do to liberate ourselves from our own shame and guilt, because that's a big one for white people in terms of racism, masses and masses of shame and guilt. Yeah, if we're not doing that work ourselves, how can we be helpful to other people to do it as well? Because that's a big part of me for this new definition of difference, committing to read it again, read that actual definition again. I still haven't got this one embedded.
So it is now committing to freedom from untrue assumptions driving prejudice. Committing to freedom from untrue assumptions driving prejudice.
Right. And so if we think of the components as a way of being in the world, a big question for me about this new definition is, when I say I'm committing to freedom from untrue assumptions that drive prejudice, I can do the work of committing to my own, freedom from my own, the ones that I apply, that I have internalized towards myself, and the ones that I may be holding about other people. But how do I commit to freedom from your untrue assumptions that drive your prejudice? How do I commit to that? That's a big question for me. Like, yeah, I mean, obviously, as it says in Nancy's paper, we can proliferate our work with the diversity process, and then I'm helping other people to start to notice theirs. But if you're not noticing yours, and your untrue assumptions are driving prejudice in you, which may be towards me or other people, how do I commit to freedom from that? That's a big question for me. What do you think? Thank you for listening for so long. I feel like I went off on a major tangent there.
No,
but
it's
well done.
really interesting. The thing is, I think this is the component that actually requires thinking, as in it needs this, it needs time. So when you were just saying that, Tricia, like part of my response to that is my commitment to allowing other people to get free from their untrue assumptions is immersing them in a thinking environment.
Mm.
Because I suppose my experience of being over years and years and years and years of thinking for myself, it's actually very hard to stay in denial over time. So it might be for a while, but actually, as I do more and more thinking sessions, and as I have somebody else who's listening to me with encouragement and interest and treating me like an equal and appreciating me, actually there's something about what all of those judgments, all of that prejudice, it feels like there's more space for me to think about it. And I think part of, every time we can create the conditions where someone can really think for themselves and challenge any assumptions, it might not be about prejudice, but they're learning to unpick, what has limited them. And I think over time, we will eventually start choosing topics which do require deeper work and do touch into those topics around what am I ashamed of, and where don't I feel worthy, and where don't I feel safe, and do I feel like I belong? Because my experience is yet sometimes I think, and it's quite transactional and it's quite, but over time it isn't. You go for that deeper work, and maybe this way of being the same with it's like it's a practice and it's a journey, and it's not like my commitment is to stay with the practice, and my commitment is to keep thinking, and my commitment is to allow you the time, or the time to take the time it takes to do the work without losing my sense of ease, and without losing a sense of equality, and without thinking, well, just get there. So I think there's that commitment that we can do that. And I also think this commitment to the other person, like how do I be that with you, is not requiring you to censor what it is you're most scared of. And I think that's the work of a thinking environment, isn't it? That you can choose a topic where you can think about this. Because where else can I know I could have a thinking session with you where I was thinking about something where I felt deeply ashamed. So whether that's about race or about whatever it is that's come up for me, where I've got prejudice, and or even, like the lesser cousin of prejudice, like judgment. I'm like, oh my God, I judge everything. I judge so much, including myself, a lot. But to actually be able to think about that and bring that to a thinking session, and to know that I'm not going to be judged, and I'm not going to be shamed, and I'm not going to be censored, that also I think is a commitment. And sometimes I think, my experience of this is it's really hard. Like, I think it can be really hard to be with someone and be really encouraging and attentive, and appreciative, when actually somebody's thinking very differently to me. And again, I'd love to say that's not, and I think people, especially we're teachers of this, and people see us and it's like, oh no, sometimes I find it really hard to be with people who I find very, very different to me. And that's also the commitment, is can I still stay present? What do you think?
I think you're brilliant. I really do. I think everything that you've just said there is so helpful. So helpful. And what was so brilliant about everything you said there, Sophie, was that return to ease. Because what I realized as I was listening to you is I get very hot under the collar about prejudice. And I'm sure a lot of that is my own, is my own still yet to be done work, because there's a kind of an arrogance, or a risk of arrogance in that, as if I'm further down the road than somebody else, if I'm listening to somebody and what I'm hearing is assumptions that are driving prejudice in their thinking towards others that they appear not to be recognizing. And everything that you've just said there, the work that I have to do to be a good thinking partner across the presence of difference if the thinker is expressing things that I don't agree with. And that was a major, 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 major breakthrough for me in my thinking environment journey, when I realized, back in the day when it was still called diversity, and I can't remember which definition we were on then, when I realized that diversity, or difference as we're calling it now, was an invitation for me to stay interested when I didn't agree, especially when I didn't agree. Actually, that was the practice that it was inviting. That was the way of being that it was inviting from me. So I love everything that you've just said there, because it's a huge call to ease, and to trusting the intelligence of the human mind that I'm listening to, which I think is the big promise that we make as thinking partners, is to have faith in the intelligence that's at work in this human mind that we're listening to, and that if that intelligence is currently laboring under some falsehood, and hasn't yet recognized that it is, and therefore isn't liberating itself from it, my job is to trust that process, and not think that I know better for this person, because what do I know? I don't know what this human being has gone through in their life that's given rise to those internalized assumptions in the first place. And I also know, to the extent that I do, and it's not a done deal at all, it's still a long road that I'm walking on this journey, but I know the work that I've had to do, painful work, painful, deeply embarrassing, shameful, work that I've had to do in my journey as a white person around racism, and yeah, so I think what you just said is just such a beautiful reminder that's the work that we're doing here. And absolutely, you're right. If we're creating thinking environments for people, that is a perpetual onion layer peeling exercise of removing the things that are getting in the way of our being able to think well for ourselves, which will include the untrue limiting assumptions that we've internalized over the course of our lifetime, whether it's about group identities or something else. So thank you for what you said there. That was really, really helpful. What do you think now?
Oh, as you were talking, there's something for me here, Tricia, about safety. And like, I know we sort of say safety is a byproduct of the components, but I actually think this, when we're committing to freedom from untrue assumptions that drive prejudice, there is something for me about when we're in a thinking environment. So when we're setting up a thinking environment, whether that's with an individual or a small group, it's not making assumptions that what I think will enable people to feel safe is what will enable people to feel safe. So there's something for me about, how do I know that just because, so me as a middle-aged white woman, like, I do something, I think, oh, well, that'll make us safe. And there's something about, how do we populate that space with a real humanness? And I know we do that, but like, I was thinking about, what is it we do? And I think often what we do is, like, it might look structurally like rounds, but actually what we're trying to do there is share stories, isn't it? It's like trying to humanize and actually connect on a place of who we are, rather than what we do. You never ask questions about, so what's your job, and tell me about, we're really trying to connect on actually, like, who are you? And I think part of it is like, can we get to know each other, and can we get to understand each other's journeys and our stories, and what makes us who we are, but with a level of safety that feels appropriate. So not just, diving in, but so there is something for me about, to really challenge and to really commit to this, we've got to feel safe. And all of the thinking inhibitors, I think, then come in, so if I feel embarrassed, cynical, judged, humiliated, embarrassed, I'm not going to be able to think well, you know, because I'll instantly get a stress response. And yet I think there is some, you know, our brains find this hard. So we're, you know, I think we spoke in the last conversation we had around like these currents. And again, I think that there's a real challenge to kind of, if we don't actively do the work, step outside our own comfort zones, challenge what we feel, you know, do these things, we'll just fall back into normal, whatever we've always done before, because that feels comfortable, doesn't it? But I think that can also not always be safe for other people. And again, I mean, it's sharing personally, but there is something about, if I'm not willing to look at how my own internalized assumptions about the groups I'm part of, if I can't do that for myself, there must be a part of me that feels there's something wrong with that. And therefore, if I think there's something wrong with how I'm feeling, I'm naturally going to tether you to that feeling. And that's going to all be invisible. But I will censor you, I'll tether you to the limits of my own prejudice, I think. Which is horrible to admit, isn't it? Like, that's hard. It's hard. What do you think?
Yeah. I'm pondering what you've just said. I feel like I'm going to need a lot more time to think about what you've just said. So let me see if I can work my way through it. So if I'm not willing to look at the feelings that I have, the negative feelings, the uncomfortable feelings that I have about a group identity to which I belong, which I haven't done the work of examining and liberating myself from the untrue limiting assumptions that I've internalized that are attached to that group identity, then I'm going to, you use the word tether you to my own lack of safety there, because you started off by talking about safety in that last wave of thinking that you did. So yeah, it's interesting. It's going to be, yes, it's very, very interesting what you're saying, because I had this breakthrough realization about the component of equality the last time I was teaching the coaching program. And what I realized was that with regards to the component, I mean, isn't this just amazing? I mean, 19 years in and I'm seeing something about a component that I've never seen before. I just love that about this work, that, you know, it's, yeah, I mean, it's just, you just keep going and keep going, don't you, in terms of what you discover with regards to it. But the realization that I had is that I can do everything in my power to create the experience of equality for you between us. But if you don't think you're equal, then my capacity to create that component for you is going to be hampered by your inability to accept the invitation that I'm offering to be equal in the relationship. And I think if I've got it, if I use that analogy, that insight that I had about equality there, and apply it to what you just said about difference, if I've excavated, I mean, I don't know what might be one of your untrue limiting assumptions that you've got attached to a group identity, but given that you were born and raised in England, I'm going to go for class, because I just think it's such a prevalent one in England. And let me do this with regards to my dad, because my dad was born in Lancashire and left school at 14 to go and work in the factory with his dad. And by the end of my dad's life, he was the chairman of a group of companies all around East Africa, self-made man, not super wealthy, but had done well for himself and was able to leave money in his will to his kids and stuff like that. You know, I mean, he would nothing that he could have ever envisaged with the childhood that he had. But, you know, I could, let's say in this example, be with my dad, having done my own work on liberating myself, which has actually been work that I've had to do my whole lifetime, and it's still not done. It's really not done. The stuff that goes on for me when I'm in the presence of really wealthy people, you know, because I know the roots that I came from, very working class, both my parents. I mean, my mum was one of 9 kids born on the west coast of Ireland in a potato field. I mean, she wasn't actually born in the field, but you know, you know what I mean. They lived in a little cottage in a potato field. So yeah, I mean, there's a discomfort there around money and wealth, and that, you know, I don't come from that. So anyway, the point I'm making here is, if I've done all the work that I can possibly do to liberate you and I from those untrue limiting assumptions around money and wealth and class and all of that stuff, if you haven't done that work, it doesn't matter how much I'm creating an environment for our thinking to be liberated from that. My capacity to create an environment free from those untrue limiting assumptions that are driving prejudice with regards to class and money will be tethered by your not having done that work, and by your, let's say you in this instance, I'm making an assumption here, but you're still carrying shame around that. So is that what you were saying, that your shame will limit the thinking that we can both do together, whether we're aware of it or not? Is that what you were saying, or have I misinterpreted?
I think so. And as you're talking, for me, and again, this isn't thinking environment language, but there's there's something for me about authenticity.
Mm.
And you know, and I always love that quite, like, you know, being courageous and being authentic are the same thing.
Mm.
You know, and there's something about, if I'm with you and you've done that work and you're sitting in your identity, good, bad, ugly, all of that, there is an authenticity to you, which I think is an invitation. Actually, it's an invitation for somebody else to also step into and have the courage to be authentic. And so I think, does it mean I can never do the work? I think it's much more likely I'm going to do the work when I'm with somebody who can sit with it, and they are who they are. You know, but if neither of us have done the work, I think that's almost impossible. But yeah, there's something for me about, it's an invitation to authenticity. But an invitation doesn't need to be responded to, does it? Yeah. And so just say somebody's watching this, Trisha, and it's like, God, there's quite a lot in here, isn't there? And it's, so I suppose, what is it we would share? So on a course on, like, is it a question, or is it a practice, or is there something that we would really want to allow people to start kind of journeying with this component?
I so appreciate the way you bring me back to, you know, bring me back to earth in these dialogues, because there's something about the way you participate in dialogue, Sophie, that forwards the movement so beautifully. I really appreciate that. I mean, in a way, I'm going back to something that you said earlier, which is around feelings of shame or embarrassment or guilt or unhappiness with myself, with the way that I am, and to use that as a signpost for where might I have untrue limiting assumptions attached to my group identities, and to choose to make a conscious decision, to choose to live a life free of shame and embarrassment and guilt, you know, to see those emotions as signposts for where there's some work for me to do, and to decide to take it on. I think that's a really good starting point. What do you think?
I mean, I think from this conversation, what it's really encouraged me to do is to dedicate more thinking time to this area, like specifically, like what are the things I feel still shame around? What are the conversations I'm not willing to have? What would I be embarrassed about saying or doing, you know, for fear of getting it wrong, or for fear of and there is also something for me about when, and again, I love this interplay with the components around, like when we talk about information, we talk being able to absorb information. I think prejudice stops me absorbing information. And again, if we define prejudice as untrue assumptions, of course it does, because assumptions stop us absorbing information. But there's something for me around when I'm in a position where there is conflict. I don't mean like high level conflict, you know, but like just a disagreement, somebody says something, I feel challenged, I can feel myself get that stress response. I think almost challenging myself at that point, maybe not in the moment, but to afterwards do the work about what was it that just happened that caused me to have that threat response. And I can remember years ago, Trish, I don't even think I shared this with you, but I remember we were on a conversation once, and it might even have been about this component, and you said something and I could feel my body tense. And I was like, oh, and then it was like, this is Trisha. Like, Trisha is not threatening you. Like, Trisha is not, like, we have a very good relationship, you know, it's like, you know, but my body felt like there was a stress, a threat. And afterwards, I did some thinking about, well, what was it you said that just really challenged me? Because it wasn't you weren't threatening me, you weren't making me feel unsafe. It was something you'd said had triggered an assumption in me. And I found that really helpful. One, to observe it, to notice it, but also then not to just dismiss it, but to go, oh, and I mean, interesting, like we've got an election coming up in the UK, and I find myself, like, I notice straight away, somebody might say something and I instantly dismiss it. And I just go, oh, and they are therefore this. And I can just feel like these assumptions, these judgments are just so on the tip of my tongue, like they're just there. But to do the work to go, actually, is that true? Is that true? Like, do I really think it's true that all people that vote for this particular party are racist? Or do I, you know, because it's like, do I really think that's true? But actually, that's what happens straight away. So I think for me, my practice is, one, observing it, that you know, that judgment, the prejudice when I see it, but also to give it the importance it deserves, which is to think about it and to spend the time to, and not with any urgency, because I think it is a lifetime's work. But it's like yeah, and I guess that's it, isn't it? Like, committing to freedom, it's not like committing to making it disappear. It's not committing to saying I'm never going to be prejudiced. It's committing to knowing that actually I will keep making untrue and limiting assumptions about myself and others based on nonsense. And I've got a space, because I know the thing might work, and keep challenging that. What do you think?
Yeah, I love what you've said there again. And I think committing to freedom from untrue assumptions that drive prejudice includes creating the freedom for ourselves to be able to talk to one another about it. So I'm just imagining in those conversations where you're having that that trigger and that stress response, what would it be like if you were able to say to that person that you're listening to, who's talking about voting for whoever and about whom you're now having a reaction, I notice that I think that people who vote for that party are all like this. What do you think about that? You know, to be able to open up the dialogue, because what might we learn? You know, what might we discover that actually the assumption that we're making, I mean, we might discover that they're, I don't know, for want of a bet, let's use this example, racist or anti-immigration or, you know, whatever. But they might have very, very, very different reasoning and very different history about why that that we wouldn't have a clue of if we don't enter into the conversation. And I think I'm just realizing now that for me, committing to freedom from untrue assumptions that drive prejudice, for me, the lived experience of that is the freedom to be able to have those conversations with people and to not just dismiss them in my mind and shut down and write them off, and they don't even know what's happened, you know, inside me. But I've certainly stopped being a thinking environment for them, that's for sure. What do you think?
Well, I think this is, I mean, I've just found this conversation so interesting because it so shows how the components call to each other. Because if I can't stay interested, I'll never be free, you know. And and then there was two other things that came to mind, which were in terms of like practices. And there is something that, I mean, I've been doing this work for 15 years and teaching it for quite a lot now, but a year, if not twice a year, I teach the diversity process. And as part of that, I do the work, you know, so we teach it, but we also do it. And so there is something for me about, as practitioners of this work, we need to be doing that practice regularly. And also, I often will teach the hand on the moon practice, which is around how we deal with conflict. And I found that extraordinarily helpful in terms of understanding my own stories about how I am in conflict and why. And that's why it prompted when you just said that. And then also really having a lot more compassion, not just to myself, but also to other people, because we just don't know. We don't know why someone has an opinion. We don't know why someone behaves in a certain way. We don't know anything really about anyone. But can I hold that with a bit more compassion and more kindness and more generosity? And can I make the most generous assumptions rather than the most quick and limiting? But I think there are practices that can really almost be the not the discipline, that's too strong a word, but the commitment. You know, if I regularly do these two practices and I regularly think for myself, I think it helps. So is there anything more, Trish? And I'm aware we need to close, don't we? We could talk about this one for ages. Is there any, yeah, let's do one, a final, but yeah, what more do you think or feel or want to say about difference?
Well, I just completely agree with you about that diversity practice. I mean, one of the things that the diversity process practice, I mean, one of the things that I just amazes me again. I mean, I don't know how many times I've taught that process now. And recently I've started to find new identities that have never shown up on my list before. You know, ones that are lurking deep, you know, in your psyche, that you realize, oh yeah, I identify with that group. And it's never shown up on my list before. So the assumptions that I'm carrying around that group identity is deeply buried in me. And how might that be showing up then in terms of this invitation to commit to, you know, creating environments that are free from the untrue limiting assumptions that drive prejudice? If I've got an identity that I don't even know I've got, and I've never done any work on it. So I just want to celebrate that suggestion that you made there, that doing that work is a really good it's a really solid way of working with this, and it really helps. Yeah. And then doing what you and I have just done, which is creating the safety and the permission to think together about the component itself, and what it takes to respond to the call that component is inviting us to respond to. And I loved what you said about invitation, by the way. It's only an invitation if you can say no as well, and to have compassion for the places where we are still a no around difference is so important. I agree. And that's it. I don't think I've got anything more to say. What do you think? Anything more that you want to add?
I think my final thought is that it's okay for it to be hard. That this component, I think it can go very quickly to kind of core assumptions about safety, belonging, worthiness. Am I okay? I'm not a nice person. And to hold that with the other components. So can I hold that different? That is challenging and it can be difficult, but can I also hold that with encouragement and appreciation and equality and ease and information? And if I do that, I think it will be safe. You know, but we can do hard, as in it's okay to do hard things and for it to be hard, and but yeah, and that it's gonna bring up feelings, and that is also, can we embrace that, and so no, I think our starting point is I don't think difference is different, but I also think it's difficult.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Trish? And then we'll appreciate.
Yeah, no, I'm just very, very happy to move into appreciation, because I'm dripping with it at the moment over here in Cape Town. Just, I think it goes to something that you acknowledged and highlighted in our time together today, the thing of authenticity and courage, and the way in which we create a safe space for other people because we go there ourselves. And I think there's something about your awareness, your awareness, your sharing of that awareness of the issue of judgment and how judgmental we are as human beings, and your ownership of that, and your ability to be real about it, makes you so safe. It makes you such a safe person to be with, and I really, really appreciate that about you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Trish. I feel like you've appreciated me the whole session, so I will just allow that one to be absorbed. Oh, and Trisha, I think the quality that I really appreciate today is like and this is said in the most wonderful way, that you have this childlike delight and curiosity about everything, and you're just so interested, but it's the delight that you have in the exploration and the questions and what we don't know and how unattached you are to outcomes. It's like, let's just play, so it's the curiosity and the inquisitiveness is what I'd like to appreciate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.